Well, hello out there, and welcome to my Real Estate Exam Prep podcast series. Over the years, I've helped hundreds of students start their real estate careers, and my goal is to help you pass your exams using some simple, straight talk about each of the National Exam Prep topics. You can check out all 11 podcasts in this National Exam Prep series, and for additional information, check out my full listen videos for each topic on my YouTube channel. Today our focus is on contracts and what you need to know to pass your exams. We're going to start with keywords and concepts and then discuss in detail the types of exam questions you can expect to see. Let's start with these key terms, key concepts that apply to all contracts, not just real estate contracts. First key terms you're going to want to remember are express versus implied contracts. What's the difference between an express versus an implied contract? This is pretty self-explanatory, but an express contract has all of the details and all the terminology expressly laid out. Everybody knows what their responsibilities and obligations are. A purchase agreement between a buyer and a seller is clearly an example of an express agreement. But an implied agreement is something different, and you'll want to know the difference here for your exam. An implied agreement is entered into by somebody's actions. The implication is there, implied by their actions. And believe it or not, each one of you enters into implied contracts every day, probably several. If you ever go into a restaurant and order a meal, you sit down, order the meal. Nobody brings you a piece of paper or a contract to sign. They just bring you the meal, and you sit there and you eat it, and the implication is that you're going to pay for it before you leave. That indeed is an implied contract. So if you're not sure if that's the case, get up and walk out before paying for your meal. Likely somebody will track you down and say, hey, you need to pay for this before you leave. It's a contract between you and the restaurant. So that's the basic difference between express and implied contract. Word associations for your exams. Implied contracts are entered into by virtue of somebody's actions. You also need to know the distinction between bilateral and unilateral contracts. Sometimes you have to watch for keywords in the questions carefully and the description to decide if it's a bilateral or a unilateral contract. A bilateral contract is one entered into where both parties make promises. Once again, a purchase agreement is a great example. Buyer says, I promise to buy, and the seller says they promise to sell. That's a bilateral contract. Both parties are making promises. But watch carefully the wording in some of their scenarios they set up in test questions about a unilateral contract. In real estate, an option agreement is a unilateral contract. If I want to buy your property, I may not want to buy it today, but I might want to buy an option to buy your property. So I enter into an option agreement. Only one party is obligated and only one party is making a promise. If I want to buy your property, I might come to you and say, I'd like to buy an option to buy your property. If I'm a land developer, the advantage to me is I have a certain amount of time, maybe 6 months or a year, to go to the city, to go to other people and draw my plans and get my building cost estimates so I can decide if in fact my project is feasible if I buy your land. But I don't want to do all that work not knowing if I can buy your land or not. So I'll come to you and say, I will give you an option fee up front to be negotiated if you agree to sell me your land within 1 year for, we'll say, $1 million. I haven't bought the land. What I've bought is the option to buy your land. Think about it that way. So who's making a promise? Am I promising to buy your land? No. I'm buying the option to buy your land. But if I decide to exercise that option and actually go ahead and decide I want to purchase your land at the end, before the end of that option agreement term, Are you obligated to sell it to me? Yes, you have to. So there's one promise, and that's made by you, the seller, that if I decide to buy, then you will sell it to me. But do I have to buy the land? No, once again, I don't have to. In those agreements, if I decide not to exercise my option and buy the land before the term ends of that agreement, then I will typically forgive my my option money. I will let you keep my option money. So as the seller of the land, you can keep my option fee if I decide not to buy the land. So only one party is making a promise in an option agreement, and that is the seller. You need to know the difference between addendums and amendments. An addendum is something that goes with a contract and is part of the original contract as it's being signed by both parties. A purchase agreement. A buyer makes an offer to a seller. It will likely contain several addendums in today's marketplace. If I want to buy your house, I'll come to you and say, I'm going to make you an offer to buy your house, but here's a financing addendum. My purchase is contingent upon me being able to get financing. Or my purchase of your house is contingent upon me being able to sell my existing property. Or maybe a home inspection. All of those contingencies would be contained in addendums that would go with my original offer to you. But an amendment is something that changes an existing agreement that's already been signed. Simplest example, it would be if you and I have an agreement that's already been signed, all the contingencies are removed, we're ready to close in 2 weeks, and I come to you and say, would you do me a favor? Could we please delay closing for 3 days? So you might agree to say, yeah, we can do that. So if you and I both agree that we want to change the closing date by 3 days, how do we change that original contract that's already been signed? It's already an existing contract. We would change that through an amendment. And the deal with an amendment is if you're going to change any terms of an existing contract, then all the parties that signed the existing contract have to sign the amendment. Everyone has to be in agreement, clearly. That's an amendment. Changes after the contract is signed. 2 other quick terms, the difference between an executed contract and an executory contract. We'll start with the executed contract. That's the simple one. The contract has been signed. It's done. It's executed. So, purchase agreement after closing is a contract that has been executed. And so an executory contract, one that's in the executory stage, is one where basically all the terms and conditions have been met, but the contract isn't finalized yet. In real estate, the contract isn't closed yet. So right before closing date, that contract is in the executory stage. All we're doing is waiting for closing. Now, 3 other terms about the validity of contract that are very important for your exam. This is very important. If you're taking notes, it's a good place to make a couple of notes. There's 3 categories of contracts. We're talking about a valid contract, a void contract, and a voidable contract. 3 distinct categories of contracts: valid, void, and voidable. You must know the difference between these for your exam. And this is a good time for me to share with you the types of exam questions you'll see. Basically, you likely know this by now. All of your exam questions that you have to take to get your license will be 4-choice, multiple choice questions. Okay? So, and a lot of those questions will be except questions. They'll go something like this. All of the following answers apply except. All of the following statements are true except. And then you have to find the outlier, the one that is not correct or that does not apply. So knowing that you're going to have multiple choice questions throughout the exam and that you'll have 4 choices for those is going to help you study. It should help you, give you an idea of how to study. One of my test tips all along has been over the years, when you read your material from your education provider and you go through it, look at different topics that you're covering, and in certain instances it's easy to write your own test question. And by that I mean envision what the test question might be, because it's likely that going to be the way it'll show up on the exam. So I'll give you some illustrations of that as we go through our valid, void, and voidable categories of contracts. First of all, what makes a valid contract? There's always a few test questions on the validity of a contract. So a valid contract must contain 4 essential elements. Does that sound like it's tailor-made for a multiple choice question? You bet it is. Excuse me. Valid contracts have 4 essential elements. And again, a good place to make some notes if you have the ability. Don't do it if you're driving right now, certainly. But 4 essential elements of a valid contract. Number 1, meeting of the minds. Meeting of the minds. Some states call it consent. But what constitutes meeting of the minds? All the parties are on the same page. There are actually 3 stages of meeting of the minds, one of the essential elements. So the 3 stages of meeting of the minds, very important for your exam: offer, acceptance of the offer, and communication of the acceptance of the offer. So in a nutshell, a buyer makes an offer to a seller. The buyer signs the offer, sends it to the seller. The seller looks at the offer, and let's assume the seller likes the offer. The seller says, this is a good offer, and the seller signs the offer. Seller signs the offer at 10 o'clock at night at their kitchen table. All the sellers sign the offer. At that point, since the buyer signed it when they made the offer, and the seller has signed it and shown they accept the offer, is it a valid contract yet? No, it is not. What's the third step here we're missing? The third step is communication of that acceptance by the seller has to be made to the buyer or the buyer's agent. So you've got to have that communication of the acceptance. So offer, acceptance, and communication of acceptance. Once the seller or the seller's agent calls the buyer or the buyer's agent and says, good news, the seller has signed the offer, now it's a contract. Now it's a valid contract because communication has been made. So remember the 3 pieces of meeting of the minds, because they'll surely be on the test. The second essential element of a valid contract is capacity. Capacity, both mental capacity and age capacity, legal capacity and mental capacity. Those requirements must be met for the contract to be a valid contract. So the second essential element is capacity. The third essential element of a valid contract is consideration. There has to be consideration made as one of the 4 essential elements in a valid contract. So here's the thing I want to stress. I was going to say make a note, but if you're driving, don't try and write things down. But here's the note you want to make in your mind. Consideration in this instance is not earnest money. It is not earnest money. Please remember this for your example. Earnest money is not an essential element of a valid purchase agreement. Earnest money is not required by law to be part of a purchase agreement. Now, let me share this with you. Is it often used? Is it most likely used? Do most sellers require earnest money to be part of a valid offer to them? Yes, they do. Most sellers want it. But that's not what makes the purchase agreement a valid purchase agreement. I can't stress that enough, that people get that wrong on the exam all the time. Earnest money is not required for a purchase agreement to be a legal document. What is required is consideration. So in this sense, then what is consideration? Well, consideration is promises. Promises. So consideration is promises as one of the four essential elements. I promise to buy, if you promise to sell, other promises and warranties that are made in the purchase agreement. That is consideration, but not earnest money. I can't stress that enough. And the fourth essential element is the fact that the contract has to be for a lawful or legal purpose. You can't have a contract between two parties that has the first three essential elements, but the contract is for one party to steal the other party a car, and then the other person will pay them a sum of money once they deliver the stolen car. That contract is automatically void, so it is not a valid contract. Okay? So legal purpose, lawful purpose. So remember these four elements of a valid contract: meeting of the minds, capacity, consideration, and lawful objective. So that begs the question then, if a contract isn't valid, what is it? Well, if it doesn't contain one of those four essential elements of a valid contract, it's automatically void. On its surface, it's automatically void. So if it's missing even at least one of those four essential elements. So there you have a valid contract and a void contract. Valid's got to have all four elements. Void is missing at least one. Those are the two simple terms. What you're going to struggle with on the test, or at least wrestle with on the test likely, is what's a voidable contract? And I want to take a couple of minutes and talk about voidable contracts. So you'll have an area on the exam and they'll ask you about valid, void, and voidable. Voidable contracts. A voidable contract is defined as a contract where one party may disaffirm the contract or may back out of the contract for either misrepresentation, duress, or if that party is a minor. So if you signed a contract because somebody said, you better sign this or I'll break your arm, that's under duress. If you signed it, you could back out of it because you were under duress. But the most common example you're going to find on your exam is one using a minor. And here's an example I've used again over the years to make this point. Let's assume some internet wizard young person who's made $1 gazillion on the internet comes to your house one day and says, I love your house. I really want to buy the house and I'll pay you whatever you want for the house. And let's say this person is 15 years old. And you say, well, you got to be kidding me. I'll take $1 million for my house, my little bungalow in the city. I'll take $1 million for that. And the 15-year-old says, fine, I'll pay you the money. And so the 15-year-old brings you a contract, and it's the 15-year-old that signs the contract and hands it to you. Now, number one, can a 15-year-old sign a purchase agreement? Well, yeah, they can sign it. Certainly they can. It's fine. There's in fact nothing in the United States that says minors can't buy property. They can buy property. So they hand the purchase agreement to you and you sign it. So now you as an adult have sold your house on paper. You've got a valid purchase agreement at this point. I misspoke. It's a purchase agreement between you and a minor. Is it a valid purchase agreement? Answer is no, because the minor doesn't meet the capacity essential element of a valid purchase agreement. However, think about this. Could the minor proceed and purchase your house if they wanted to? Yes, they could. They could. Can the minor back out of that contract if they choose to, based on the fact that they're a minor? Yes, they can back out if they choose to. They may disaffirm the contract because they're a minor. However, can you disaffirm the contract? Answer is no, you can't as a seller. You don't want to. They paid you way too much money for the house. You don't want to back out. You can't back out. But the minor could back out if they want to. And that is indeed what makes that contract voidable. So all of the cards lay with the minor at that point. They can proceed if they want to and pay the money, or they could back out because that contract is voidable. So watch out for the language they use in your test questions and the scenario they lay out. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the enforceability of contracts. What makes a contract enforceable? And remember now, validity and enforceability of contracts are two totally separate issues. Let's talk about what makes a contract enforceable. To do that, we have to talk a little bit about the statute of frauds. You've seen that in your coursework, I'm sure. The statute of frauds in almost all states says that the transfer of any legal interest in real property must be in writing. So I want you to make that mental note about the statute of frauds. It says certain contracts have to be in writing. So if I sell you my house, we're going to want that in writing, because certainly a purchase agreement is the transfer of a legal interest. But where you'll get some questions on the exam is, how about leasing? If I lease you a house that I own, and you and I sign a lease, am I transferring a legal interest in my property to you? Yes, I am. I'm transferring you the right of possession. So leases involve the transfer of a legal interest in real property. So statute of frauds on the exam is going to address certain types of leases that have to be in writing, and some where there's an exception and they don't have to be in writing. Here's the exception you'll see on the exam in most states. Leases of 12 months or less are not required to be in writing to be enforceable. Wow, what does that mean? That means if I agree to lease you a house for 6 months, and you and I shake hands on it, and it's an oral lease, there's nothing in writing, and you and I agree to do that, does that lease need to be in writing to be enforceable? The answer is no. Now, is it hard to enforce? Absolutely. Difficult? Absolutely. Should it be in writing? Yes, it would. But those aren't the questions they're going to ask you on the exam. They're going to want you to understand that by virtue of the statute of frauds, leases of 12 months or less do not have to be in writing to be enforceable. Which means what? If I lease you my house for 13 months or more, does it have to be in writing to be enforceable? Absolutely. And those are the numbers and the time periods they'll key on the exam. So remember that. And that's because of the statute of frauds. There's another statute you're going to want to pay attention to and understand for the test, and that's the statute of limitations. Statute of limitations deals with time. Any time frame or time period in a contract has to be followed, or the contract can become voidable based on the statute of limitations. So if we have to close on a certain date, if you have 10 days for an inspection, if you have 60 days to sell your existing home, and that's in the contract, all of those time frames fall under the statute of limitations. So I'm also big for studying on word associations. These will help you study for your exam. Word associations here would be statute of limitations deals with time. The statute of frauds deals with contracts in writing. Certain contracts that have to be in writing. A third topic right in line with this is the doctrine of laches. Doctrine of laches simply says the court or a judge may rule that one party cannot sue the other party if the judge feels that the timing of the lawsuit is unfair to one side or the other. So think about it this way. Given the doctrine of laches, a judge or a court could latch somebody out of court. They could lock somebody out of court, primarily because they think the timing of the lawsuit is unfair to one side or the other. So that's the doctrine of laches. You won't need to know any more than that about the doctrine of laches for the exam. Your national real estate exam is going to have several questions about specific real estate contracts. So let's talk about some of the most common ones and what you're likely to see on the exam. We'll start with the purchase agreement. They're going to have several questions asked several different ways on the exam about the purchase agreement. So here's what you want to remember. Purchase agreements, number one, are bilateral contracts. Both parties are making promises. There must be an offer, acceptance, and remember, communication of that acceptance back to the buyer before that becomes a valid contract. Offer, acceptance, and communication of the contract. Now, you'll also have to know your ors and e's with respect to each one of these types of contracts. By that I mean the buyer who makes an offer is the offeror. The ORs are the giver. So the offeror is the buyer who gives an offer to the seller. The seller receives the offer, so the seller is the offeree. So you must know when you get to the exam, they're likely not going to say buyer and seller. Not in all cases. In some cases, they'll say the offeror and the offeree. Well, who is the offeror? Typically, it is the buyer. The buyer makes an offer to the seller. So know your ors and e's. I'll throw in another side note right here just to embellish on that a little bit. What if the seller doesn't accept the offer and makes a counter offer to the buyer? So if you're the buyer and you want to buy my house, you send me an offer that says you'll pay this much money. And I look at the offer and say, it's a pretty good offer, but not good enough. So I change the offer. Some key points right here. I change the offer and make you a counter offer. Well, what's happening in a counter offer? You made the original offer to me. You're the offeror. I'm the seller. I'm the offeree. Number one, if I counter the offer, my counter or change of your offer to me terminates your offer to me. Your offer to me is gone, doesn't exist anymore. It terminates your original offer. And in a counter offer, I'm making an offer as a seller, I'm making an offer back to you. Which means what? I, as a seller, am now the offeror. I'm making an offer to you, so I'm the offeror, and you, as the buyer, are receiving an offer from me, so the buyer is now the offeree. So just know that this is the only place in real estate where the ors and e's, offeror and offeree, change places. It's the only place they change places. By countering your offer to me, I'm actually making another offer, a different offer, back to you. So as a seller, I'm the offeror, you're the offeree. So ors and e's, remember you follow those. Those offers and purchase agreements will often contain contingencies. I talked about those a little bit before. If you make an offer to me, you'll likely make it contingent upon you as the buyer getting appropriate financing that you want, being able to qualify to get a loan. You might want to sell an existing house. You should want a home inspection. All of those contingencies would be contained in your original offer to me. And they would be contained as what? They would be addendums. They would be addendums to your offer to me. So there are contingency addendums, financing addendums, home inspection addendums. Those are three most common ones that you'll find in the marketplace and the ones you're likely to see on the exam. But here's an exam tip for you. What is the most common contingency contained in purchase agreements today? The answer is financing. The one that almost every purchase offer contains is a contingency addendum for financing. Buyers have to be able to get financing, or they want their earnest money back and say they can't qualify. So most common contingency today is certainly financing. We've already talked a little bit about option agreements. So, question might be on the exam, who uses option agreements? Typically, it's developers who use option agreements. If I'm a land developer, I might come to you and say, I'll pay you $1 million for your land if I can get the permitting I need, get the rezoning I need. If I get all of my ducks in a row, I'll pay you $1 million for the land. But I'm not going to pay you the $1 million until I know if I can do those things. So what's a good avenue for me to use? A good document? I would like to come to you and say, I would like to buy an option to buy your land. It says in the option, and here's the key points of an option agreement. There is a fixed price for the property and a fixed time period. Price and time are fixed in an option agreement. So I would say to you, I would like 1 year to get all of my affairs in order to see if my project's going to work. And if at the end of that year, I feel like I can make my project work, then I will pay you $1 million for the property. So as a developer, I know what my costs are, what my cost of the property is. And I have a year's worth of time to go out and find out if I can get everything else in order that's going to make sense for me to want to do the project. So key points in an option agreement. Number one, time period is fixed, money is fixed. And what kind of an agreement is an option agreement? It's a unilateral agreement. At the end of that option agreement, do I have to buy the property? No. The option agreement has a big if in it. If I decide to buy at the end of that 1 year, then I will pay you the $1 million. However, if I do decide to proceed and decide I want to buy, are you obligated to sell it to me under the terms of the option agreement? Certainly you are, absolutely. So that's where you as the seller or the owner of the property are making the promise to sell to me if I decide to buy, but I'm not obligated to buy. That's why it's a unilateral agreement. So students usually ask at this point, well, what happens to the option money that I paid up front? In that case, you as the owner of the property would keep my option money. That would be my cost. I want to buy the time. Think about that. An option agreement is buying time. I want to buy myself a year to see if I can go ahead and put my affairs together and make the project work for me. So if I want to buy your property for $1 million, I'll pick a number out of the air. I might give you $10,000 in option money, an option fee up front. So I'm going to pay you to have you wait around for a year to see if I decide if I want to buy or not. So if that helps you wrap your head around option agreements a little bit, they might ask you on the exam, who often uses option agreements? It would be land developers. Okay, now that option agreement is very different from something else that might come up in your state. Similar to an option agreement is a right of first refusal. A right of first refusal is typically a letter that says, you will let me know if somebody else wants to buy it, and you'll give me the first right to buy or not buy. So let's use my scenario of the option agreement. Take it back to the beginning. I came to you and I said, I'd like to buy an option to buy your property. I'll pay you $10,000 to buy an option to buy your property for 1 year. And you say, no way, a lot of people knocking on my door. You won't sell me an option. You don't want to do it. You don't think it's in your best interest. But you then say to me, you're the owner of the property, say to me, here's what you will do. You will let me know if somebody else comes to want to buy it and wants to buy it, and then you'll let me know if that happens, and then I will have the first right of refusal. I'll be able to step in line in front of them and buy it. You would do that for me. You would do me that favor. You would give me the right of first refusal. So what are the key differences in a right of first refusal versus an option? In a right of first refusal, the price is not set. I might say to you, I can't live with that. It might, in 6 months, you might call me and say somebody else wants to buy it for $2 million, and then my project probably won't work. So I may or may not want to do a right of first refusal. But those are the differences. A right of first refusal, there is no time period set, and there is no price set. And so you, as the owner of the property, are not obligated to even sell to me or anybody else. So, in a nutshell, they might ask you this on the test: which of those two documents, a right of first refusal letter or an option contract, which one is better for the buyer, the developer? Well, that's going to be the option agreement, because the developer knows the price and knows the time period. But which one of those two options, if you will, is better for the owner of the property? Well, the owner would rather do a right of first refusal, because in a right of first refusal, the owner doesn't ever have to sell to anybody. There's no promise to sell under any circumstances. Plus, the price can fluctuate, hopefully go up, and there's no set time period. So right of first refusal is better for the owner of the property, and an option contract is better for the potential buyer of a property. Leasing property is also a big topic for your national exam. There will be several questions on leases. But let's start with the basics for leasing property. In a lease between a landlord and a tenant, what happens? The landlord transfers two rights: the rights of possession and the rights of use, to the tenant. So is that a transfer of a legal interest in the real property? Yes, it is. That's why leases are contracts. A transfer of a legal interest in property. And the legal interests are possession and use. However, the owner of the property retains a reversionary right. A reversionary right in the property simply means at the end of the lease, the possession and use rights that were transferred to the tenant revert back to the landlord. So the landlord keeps that reversionary interest. Now that's very different from a lease purchase contract. A lease purchase contract says one party, the tenant, is going to lease the property. However, at the end of the lease, they want to buy the property. And the lease purchase contract is something that's signed in the beginning. It'll be a contract to lease and purchase the property, all rolled up into one. And it might work this way. If I own a property and you want to sign a lease purchase contract for the property, you might come to me and say, Tom, I'd like to buy your house, but I can't afford to buy it right now, but we'd like to lease it for 2 years, and at the end of that 2 years, then we want to buy it. So here's what happens in a lease purchase contract. You, as the tenant and the buyer, and I, as the seller, will agree to the terms, the purchase price and the time period up front. I will lease you my property for 24 months. I will collect some rent every month for the first 24 months, and I'll apply typically some of that rent money towards your down payment. So some of your rent money is going to go towards your down payment at the end of the 2-year lease. Then the purchase agreement is already part of our contract. You will execute the purchase agreement, and I will, and then you will get title to the property once you've paid me the full amount that you have in the purchase agreement. So a lease purchase contract contains both documents, if you will, in one contract. The lease contract and the purchase agreement, all rolled into one. So the key points are: the purchase price is set up front in the beginning, and all of the terms of the lease and how much of the lease is applied towards the purchase price, they're all laid out up front, the time period, and the price you want to pay. And when do you get title to the property as a tenant purchaser? When do you get title under a lease purchase contract in a lease purchase arrangement? When you've paid the owner of the property the entire balance due in the purchase agreement. That's when title transfers. They'll also ask you on the exam different types of leases. You'll need to know these basics for the different types of leases. First one is a gross lease. A gross lease, remember this, typically in residential property. It's what people who rent homes, rent condos, typically they're on a gross lease. That simply means the tenant pays a fixed amount of rent and the landlord pays all the other expenses. That's a gross lease, and it's typical in residential property. A net lease is another type of lease, but it's most commonly found in commercial property. In commercial property, many people who lease an office space, a doctor's office, they lease from the owner of the building, typically on a net lease, where the tenant pays rent, plus they pay an additional amount for maintenance of the building. Sometimes they're called CAM charges, C-A-M, common area maintenance charges, for insurance and repairs and cleaning and all of that. So in a net lease, which is common in commercial, the tenant pays a base rent plus extra charges for maintenance of the building. And those are all different from a percentage lease. A percentage lease is often used in a mall or a shopping area by retail tenants. If you want to open a dress shop or some sort of retail store in a commercial space, you'll likely be on a percentage lease. That means that the tenant will pay a small base rent, but the tenant will also pay a percentage of their gross sales. Important point to remember. The tenant pays a percentage of their gross sales in a percentage lease to the landlord. Small rent plus, that's what the percentage means, a percentage of their gross sales. And our last topic for contracts is what happens if there's a breach of contract? If one party doesn't uphold their end of the contract, what legal remedies are available if one party or the other is in breach of the contract? You need to know the definition of each one of these for your exam. One legal remedy is liquidated damages. Liquidated damages, that's typically going to be the seller keeping the buyer's earnest money. So the buyer comes 2 days before closing to the seller and says, you know what, I don't want to buy the house anymore. We're not going to close. We're going to walk away. One remedy the seller has is to say to the buyer, well, okay, I'll sell it to somebody else, but I'm keeping your earnest money as liquidated damages. Okay. Another option is specific performance if one party is in breach. This is typically used if a seller tells a buyer a week before closing, you know what, we're not going to close. We don't want to sell our house anymore. We changed our mind. So the buyer is ready to move. They got their stuff all packed up, and the seller says, we're not going to sell. So the seller is in breach of the contract. A remedy there that the buyer would have is specific performance. The buyer could sue the seller in a specific performance lawsuit and force the seller to follow the terms of the contract, to force the seller to perform on the contract. And actually, a specific performance lawsuit is available to both buyers and sellers, but it's very hard for a seller to force a buyer to buy because of financing and loan qualifying and all of that. So remember for the exam, a specific performance lawsuit is available for both buyers and sellers in a purchase agreement. However, it's most often used by buyers to force a seller to perform and actually close on the transaction. And then there's two types of damages you'll need to be aware of for your exam that a judge might award if the whole thing goes to court. A judge could award compensatory damages. Compensatory damages are designed to compensate somebody for a loss of money. Maybe if the seller said to me, I'm not going to sell you the house, and I'm the buyer, and I've already spent a lot of money, had a big outlay, now I've got to go find a place to live, I've got to rent temporarily somewhere, I incur a lot of costs. A judge might award me some money for compensatory damages to compensate me for the money I've lost. And a judge may also award, in some cases, punitive damages. Punitive damages are for punishment. A judge may award additional punitive damages in a case in an effort to deter or dissuade somebody else from doing the same thing in the future. They're really going to punish the party who's in breach of contract to try and make as sure as best they can that nobody else will do the same thing in the future. That's the end of my podcast for contracts. I hope you found it helpful. Thank you for listening. You can always go to Tom's Next Level Real Estate, my YouTube channel, and look at full lesson videos for more information. And I will be putting up podcasts for each of the national exam prep topics soon. And always remember that your success is my goal. I wish you great success out there in your career, and go pass your exam.